When we picture unicellular organisms like many protists, we sort of think of them as these sort of helpless cells floating around in water. But like any animal, they are also adapted to fight off things that might eat them or hurt them in any way. And so we'll talk briefly about some of the things they do. So some protists have a sort of slimy layer around their cell, a mucilage. So that's coating the cell membrane or the cell wall. So if you have a cell, for example, it's going to have this slimy stuff around it that either makes it unappetizing to herbivores or makes it difficult for herbivores to consume. Many of them have a cell wall. So they might have a cell wall around their cell membrane. Depending on what that cell wall is made out of, it's actually protective. So many of them have cell walls made out of calcium carbonate. This is what shells are made out of. So like an oyster shell is made out of calcium carbonate. So it's a rigid, hard substance. So even though this is a microscopic organism, it still makes it hard for organisms to eat it. It might be made out of silica. So silica is glass, so a glass cell wall. Or they might be metals like iron and manganese. So all these are rigid stuff that makes it difficult for other cells to eat them. Some protists are capable of what's called bioluminescence. Bioluminescence means glowing from life. So this is when organisms have the ability to create something that glows. And so why does that work? Well, it disturbs. So if something starts glowing, that scares a lot of other animals and they won't eat it. There are some protists that actually release toxins. So some people have heard of killer algae. It sometimes gets into the news at different times of year because it'll be growing in certain areas. And when there's a lot of it growing, there's a high amount of the toxin that it produces in the water, and it's actually poisonous or toxic for humans and other animals. Protists also display a lot of variation in their reproduction. So all of them are capable of asexual reproduction. Remember, this is going to be through mitosis. So that's when one cell divides and makes two cells that are identical. The mother cell is gone, right? And she became these two cells. And I just want to remind you that if you have a diploid or 2N mother cell, then you will have two diploid daughter cells. But also, if you have a 1N mother cell or a haploid mother cell, then the daughters will also be 1N. So this is a haploid cell that's asexually reproducing, and a diploid cell that's asexually reproducing. So I want to make this important point because this is not the same as we are, right? We do mitosis. Whenever we do mitosis, we're always making diploid cells from diploid cells. But when we look at protists and other organisms like plants, they have haploid cells that carry out mitosis as well. So all protists can reproduce asexually through mitosis. We see that some protists also will produce a cyst. So if the normal cell looks like this, the cyst is a thick version of the cell with a really thick cell wall, and these are usually dormant. So they're a way that the cell can survive harsh conditions. So this cell might not be able to survive a frost, for example, or a frozen lake, but the cyst can. We also see cysts are important in disease, the diseases caused by protists. So in many cases, the cyst will be what transfers from one host to another, and that's how it starts a new infection. So many protists are capable of sexual reproduction, and in fact, the protists are the first types of organisms to carry out sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction is going to involve gametes and zygotes, but it's not necessarily going to occur in the same way that human sexual reproduction happens. So after sexual reproduction evolves, so we see it in protists, we see it arise separately, so through convergent evolution in animals and plants as well. It's a huge evolutionary advantage. Basically, once organisms have it, they're always going to use it. So why would it improve survival and reproductive success of organisms? Why is it such a benefit in the evolutionary story? The reason is that it generates diversity with every reproductive event. So organisms that do not sexually reproduce, offspring are always identical. So if it's asexual, offspring are identical, there's no diversity. But in sexual reproduction, all offspring are different. So there is lots of genetic variation. And that genetic variation is the raw material of evolution. So thinking back to our definitions of evolution, you can't have evolution without genetic variation. So everybody survives the same, dies the same if there's no genetic variation, which means that there's never any advantage, right? So the only way to get new species, to get new traits, new variation, to adapt to an environment is to have genetic variation. So organisms that are doing sexual reproduction are increasing their chances of acquiring a beneficial trait. So that's why we see it in so many organisms, and why it stays in many organisms once it's evolved, is because it becomes this huge evolutionary advantage. So there's 3 types of reproductive life cycles, and all 3 of them show up in Protists. So we'll take a brief look at those. So the zygotic life cycle is most common in Protists. Okay, not in all organisms, but most common in Protists. So most of the time, the cells are haploid. So if you were to look at that protist and look inside of its DNA, you would find only 1 copy of every chromosome. However, there are positive and negative mating strains, and so occasionally a positive and negative cell will combine, and that will make a diploid zygote. And the zygote becomes like these cysts that can survive bad conditions. So these are the regular cells. They're haploid. They're generated by asexual reproduction, right? So mitosis. So mitosis makes lots of these cells that are identical. You can have positive and negative mating types that exist in the environment, and these create at some point through maturation. Okay, so notice it's not mitosis or meiosis. They create these gametes, and then the gametes can connect with each other in fertilization. So it's not egg and sperm, but it's the 2 different mating types coming together. And so if you take a haploid and a haploid, you get a diploid. And this is the zygote that results from fertilization. And then this stays as just 1 cell. So unlike us, it doesn't become a multicellular organism. This diploid zygote is a cyst, so it might exist in the environment for a while. And then something will trigger it to kind of wake up and go through meiosis. And remember, meiosis is going to take a diploid cell and make 4 unique haploid cells. And these are these offspring that can then go out and carry out asexual reproduction. So this is the asexual part. Here's the sexual part. We also see the sporic life cycle occur in some protists, especially in the seaweeds, and they're multicellular. So this is some of our multicellular protists. This is also known as an alternation of generations because it's going to alternate between 2 forms, a haploid form and a diploid form. We also see this same life cycle in land plants through convergent evolution. So plants are not related to the seaweeds, but they both separately acquired this trait. And so we'll talk about it a lot in plants. So I'll just briefly go over it here. So what you have is a diploid state called the sporophyte. And the sporophyte produces spores. So sporophytes make spores. Those spores will grow into something called the gametophyte. And the gametophyte makes gametes. And in this case, we actually call them egg and sperm. Okay, so the sporophyte makes spores. The spores grow up to be gametophytes. The gametophytes make egg and sperm. The egg and sperm fertilize and make a sporophyte. And the whole process starts over again. Okay, and again, we're going to see this life cycle a lot in the plants, and we'll actually talk a lot more about it then. All right, the third life cycle that we see in protists is called the gametic life cycle. This is where all cells except the gametes, so only the gametes, are haploid. All the other cells are diploid. So another way to say this is only gametes are haploid. This is a life cycle that's rare in protists. Diatoms are some of the only protists that do it. Do you recognize this life cycle, though, where only gametes are haploid, the rest of the cells are diploid? Hopefully you see that we are examples of organisms with a gametic life cycle. So all of our cells are diploid. The only cells that are haploid are our egg and sperm. Now, we're not related to diatoms. Again, the reason why we have this is convergent evolution. We separately evolved the gametic life cycle. So the reason why diatoms do this life cycle is having to do with their cells getting too small when they carry out asexual reproduction. So during asexual reproduction, their daughter cells will get progressively smaller because they're dividing up the cytoplasm without making new stuff. And so at some point, they have to carry out sexual reproduction to get back to a big size. So we'll take a look at that. So in asexual reproduction in diatoms, here's the original cell. It divides, and then those cells divide again. And so at a certain point, you're starting to get really little cells after mitosis has happened. And so when the cells get too small, this will trigger formation of gametes. So what we have here is a cell that's divided, and maybe the cells are getting too small, and so they're going to carry out meiosis. So these are diploid cells here. They're going to take the diploid cell and divide it into haploid gametes. And then those gametes are going to come together, and so when you bring two gametes together, you're going to get bigger. So this is how it's addressing that size problem. So now this is the diploid zygote. And then that diploid zygote is now going to divide through mitosis into more diploid cells. And it's this part right here that's regenerating the bigger size. So again, this is a relatively rare life cycle in protists, but one we see in diatoms. Okay, another way that protists carry out their reproduction is to involve a host. And so this is usually harming the host. And when it harms the host, we call it a parasite. So some protists are parasites, and a lot of the protists that are parasites actually have multiple hosts that they have to cycle through. And so the most famous example is Plasmodium. Plasmodium is the cause of malaria, which is a really bad illness in sort of moist, warm, equatorial regions of the world, like in Central Africa, for example. And the Plasmodium protist requires both humans and mosquitoes. So part of its life cycle has to be carried out in mosquitoes, and part of it has to be carried out in humans. So to prevent malaria, a lot of the focus has been to eliminate the mosquitoes or reduce mosquitoes. Because if you reduce mosquitoes, that will automatically reduce the plasmodium, because they have to cycle through the mosquito. They can't just go human to human to human to human to human the way a lot of other infectious diseases are spread. They have to go human mosquito, human mosquito, human mosquito, human mosquito, human mosquito. And so if you can get rid of the mosquito part of it, it prevents malaria in humans.